Today, on Detective Story, 100 years of largely unknown, violent, organized crime history, Chicago's Chinatown.
Welcome back to Detective Story. I'm Mike Hamm, and thanks again for joining in. I really appreciate it. Back with Chris Kafkas, my brother-in-law again. Always excited to have him part of this. And today, another close friend and guest, Greg Daly, who I'll tell you a little bit about. But Greg, thanks a lot for joining us. Really
Thanks
appreciate
for
it.
having me.
So first, house cleaning. I just want to acknowledge you guys for your interest in this. We just hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, and I asked the Google machine, and it's like usually it takes 15 months to get that many. So we've done it in a few months, and that's a testament to you guys. I really appreciate it. And what that really means is for Geneva Redding,
Elizabeth
Veloz, Maggie Idzikowska, Kevin Arts, Becky Breedlove, thank you. Cole Kitchen, thank you. These victims that we've talked about, that we're trying to highlight, keep their names alive, that's what it does. It really does, and it's a testament to you guys. It means a lot to me. Please keep it up. And it allows us, we're going to find Elizabeth Veloz.
Tell your friends.
Yeah, right. Thank you. Tell your friends, invite everybody. We're going to help that Veloz family because they have been very sweet and appreciative since we did that episode with Bobby Rodriguez. And it's really jumped, and I appreciate it. So that out of the way, let's get started. I was a homicide detective for a long time, and I worked in a cold case unit that was federally funded for about 3 years. And my partner there is a brilliant guy. I'm not going to name him because I don't have his permission, and he'll throw something at me. But he did a great job on a case that was involved, and you're familiar with this case, Greg, these barge owners on the lake and river, barges, that move stuff. And like one had killed the other, his rival, because he'd not gotten a contract, or one had gotten a contract. And they were running scams and whatever. I was just like, well, what stunned me about that was like, this city, there's so many great things about this city. I love it. It's beautiful. For every bad thing, there's a million great things. But the one thing about this city, if there is a way to organize what you're doing into crime, somebody will figure it out. It's just that simple. It is unbelievable. And I'm like, when my partner told me about this, I'm like, the barge owners are like organized into crime? Like, what the hell is going? But sure enough, they were. So with that thought, I have Greg on today, who is veteran of the police department for 30 years. We met in Area 4. We had met before, but we became friends in Area 4 homicide. And we have this he is a criminal intelligence genius. And he worked in the organized crime unit for 20 years, a homicide sergeant there for years. But anything to do with intelligence and organized crime, Greg, he knows it. And so we had this just experience of talking about these shared cases that became more than just a professional relationship, a close kinship. And so today we're here to talk about, also, he is a Carter Harrison or Lambert Tree? Carter Harrison Award winner. And the Carter Harrison Award, if you're not in the Lambert Tree Award, one every year is given to the fire department, one's given to the police department. It is the highest award of valor that the city gives. I know I'm not going to embarrass him with a story, maybe another time, but it was an amazing act of valor that he amazingly well-deserved award. No, I'm very proud of him, and he should be proud of that.
All right, that's a wrap, huh?
Yeah, that's it. So thank you very much. No, we're here today.
That was a great show.
It really was. Let's let Mike ramble for a while, and then we're out the door. No, we're here today to talk specifically about this really great book he wrote called The Godfathers of Chicago's Chinatown. And in reading this and this story, I think anybody's familiar with organized crime, Chinese organized crime in particular, and if you've seen the Michael Cimino film that Mickey Rourke's still mad about, The Year of the Dragon, we think of New York's Chinatown, New York City's Chinatown, or San Francisco's Chinatown. What we've come to know, or he figured out, that in reality, most of that organized crime and real control of the Chinese organized crime came and stemmed from Chicago's Chinatown.
That's right. Yeah, Chicago had a lot like the outfit, and their fingers in Vegas and everybody else west of the Mississippi answering to them. Same thing with Chicago, where they own Houston, they own Cleveland, they own Pittsburgh. But it really, this is a lot different. I listen to your show, huge fan. But it's a lot different from the rest of your shows because while we are going to talk about William Fatman's murder, William Fatman Chin, and that's kind of the murder that takes down the entire Chinatown organized crime enterprise. But there's such a rich history that starts before that.
Right, and I want to talk about anything related to Chicago crime, and this is such an amazing, fascinating story. Again, the book is, I'm going to keep doing this to you, The Godfathers of Chinatown, Chicago's Chinatown, which is available on Amazon. I'll have all the links in that on my website, on our website, detectivestory.net, and on the show notes. But yeah, let's get right to that. I mean, we're talking about.
This is such a cool part of Chicago history.
Yeah, right. So, and Chris, I know you got a million questions, and we'll just get into it. But the scope of this is incredible because we're really talking. This starts somewhere like in the 1870s ish.
1870s, yeah.
Yeah.
So where I started, I got to add something. I didn't work any of these cases. These are all just researched by me. I just found it interesting. I even through cold case, none of these I've touched. It was all really good detectives, not me. So, but I want to start with William Fatman Chin's murder because it's such an iconic building, that An Leong Merchants Association. Now it's the Pak Tui Center, which is like a benevolent society. They have Gamblers Anonymous, and they have food pantries in there now. But before it was the An Leong Merchants Association, and before that it was just the An Leong Tong. It was their headquarters, and the murder. William Fatman was shaking down the An Leong merchants, the people that were being protected by this outfit, right? He was shaking them down, and that was a no-no. Then he finally shook down a place where the enforcer, which they called the Red Pole in their hierarchy chart, the Red Pole owned this restaurant that they shook down, and they beat him up. And that's when they drew the line and said, all right, they were going to do something about it. They hired assassins from New York. Then they knew William Fatman was going to make his way back to Chicago Chinatown at some point. They hid on the balcony. You can picture that building.
I'm thinking about it right now. You can go by and take a look at it.
They hid like snipers on the balcony, the second floor balcony of the building, and they waited for him. And when he pulled up his car, they opened up just a fusillade of bullets and just riddled the car and killed him. Took a couple months for him to die, but shot him up. And that murder took me back and took a lot of the history back, all the way back to the 1870s, when the very first Godfather of Chinatown took over, or emerged, I should say.
Right. And again, the scope of this is what just amazes me in that we're talking about this starts in 1870. They start, and the power of these guys got. I mean, they hooked up with Johnny Torrio and Capone, and it just went on for years. Just for reference, Fatman was killed in 1980.
Yes.
1980, right? So this is not like a murder from, when John Dillinger was killed. This is very recent history. And that murder starts you on this journey, right? Your interest in
it was just super. It was really interesting, and going back to when I discovered that there were these colorful characters of Godfathers, I thought it's so overlooked. It's so, when everybody talks about the St. Valentine's Day, massacre, and everyone talks about the beer wars and Capone versus Moran, nobody remembers Hip Sing versus An Leong, which was just as bloody, just as violent, and really some neat characters in the whole story.
Is that crazy?
It is crazy, and with the best names ever.
Yeah.
Right.
Best nicknames ever.
Yeah, right. Just so kind of walk us through, if you would, just the quick history of this.
Yeah, so Wale was basically Wahlee. He was kind of the first recognized organizer and the first recognized godfather of Chinatown, although they didn't call him that at the time. That moniker came much, much later. But he was a fixer. He was a guy that both ran brothels and casinos and opium dens, but he also worked with the police. And when the police had a problem with a guy named Ab Hen because he was a quote-unquote madman, he organized a community to find him, grab him, took him to Union Station, put him on a train, and said, beat it. And that was in the news. That was in the newspapers. So,
what year was this? Approximately. What time frame?
1880s.
1880.
1880s. So the next guy to take over.
So for reference there, I'm sorry, not to 1880s. We're talking. This is pre Big Bill Thompson, right? This is kind of the levee district time, right?
Right. It's still the levee or Little Cheyenne. One of their first clubs is right above McKenna's Saloon.
Yeah, I know. What was in
Hinky Dink. And,
yeah.
So it was above their saloon is where their first An Leong headquarters were. So they were right in there, and it was just an open red light district, Yeah, and it's the next guy to take over, in fact, is a guy named Sam Moy, and he's the first guy who starts wearing a cowboy hat, bright yellow suits, and he's just gregarious. And same thing, he gets pinched in Canada for human trafficking, but then he's helping the police with a murder. He's back and forth. And he gets a lot of press, and he gets a lot. In the newspapers, they quote him constantly. They use him as he's a fixer again. There was coal miners' strikes in southern Illinois, and they were trying to grab his countrymen to go down and work. Break the strikes, be strike breakers. And he said, absolutely not. Those guys are going to kill us. There's no way. And so that was a big deal. And then there was a war of the washtubs. There was real violent confrontation between the Swedes and the Chinese because the Swedes were hiring cheaper labor, and the Chinese laundries were losing money. So that was a violent war. They went back and forth, and Sam Moy stepped in and stopped it and made the peace and made everything all right.
So they're acting almost in concert then with the other organized crime groups at the time, which were a multitude, right? Like Italians, Irish.
Yes, certainly. There's evidence of that, especially later on when. So your favorite character, Opium Dong.
Opium Dong.
Which is
the best name ever.
So Sam Moy passes away, and Opium Dong takes over. And he doesn't wear the Western suits. He goes for the old-time garb, but he likes the press a lot more. And he's quoted as saying how much Chicago likes him, and he likes the Chicago people. And this is while there's a lot of anti-immigration stuff going on in San Francisco. And, they were getting slaughtered on the West Coast, and New York had a lot of the same problems with Patrick Kearns and some other racist stuff going on there. But Opium Dong found nothing but welcome in Chicago. They loved it. It was kind of the open market.
Well, if I'm like a reporter or a Flatfoot at that time, I want to use Opium Dong in every article that I do. Right?
He organized baseball games. He had two baseball teams.
Our hero, Opium Dong.
I have like a new crime hero.
Right.
Yeah, he was finally wrapped up in a murder case, murder for hire, and when he was acquitted, he took the jury, the judge, and everybody in the courtroom to a huge party in Chinatown, paid for everything. The only person that didn't show up was a prosecutor.
This guy's awesome.
The one poor legit guy sitting at home smoking a cigarette, thinking these guys. Yeah.
But so Opium Dong was a brother of Sam Moy. the very first Godfather of Chinatown. The third brother in that.
So what kind of, again, I'm sorry, but
Yeah.
time frame with Opium Dong, basically
Early 20s.
early 20s.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's when we're really kicking off.
Yeah. So yeah, like it starts in the 19 teens and goes through almost to the 30s where it's real violent going back and forth. At the same time as Capone, really.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
But the third brother, this is what's interesting. The third brother is Moy Dong Lee, and he's a playboy. He rides horses. He has an estate in Beverly Hills. He's got homes in Taiwan, China, you know, all over. And he's the guy bringing the dope over. So that was a big opium connection. And then from Opium Dong, it branched out from there. So that was all the money. And that was, so they kind of had this perfect triad, if you will.
Yeah.
Three guys, you know, Opium Dong was a street guy. Sam was the handsome guy. And the playboy was the one that was moving everything.
Yeah, right.
It wasn't. They weren't paying up to Capone, but they weren't against. There is in the book. It mentions a murder that came. A Chinese American was coming out of a restaurant, and two Italian Americans roughed him up, robbed him, killed him, and they were worried about a war. You know, like the Irish and Italians, and it was quashed right away. And I forgot who the Godfather was at the time, but he came out and said this had nothing to do with us, and it was a mistaken identity or whatever it was, and it was just a robbery gone wrong.
Yeah.
So yeah, there was a tentative, at least, agreement not to mess with each other's rackets.
That's
And later,
so Chicago.
70s and 80s, there's evidence of them paying all the way up to the outfit just for the pleasure of keeping their casinos open. But he dies and his son takes over, Frank, and Frank's the gangster. Frank dresses like Bugs Moran. Frank's got the fedora. Frank wears a bulletproof vest.
Two pistols.
He gets pinched and he says, "I was deputized," but no one will say where he got deputized.
My man.
I'm actually the police. That's awesome.
But that's when it becomes the bloodiest, and that's when the back and forth, and they're hitting laundries. There's bombs, bomb thrown through laundries and restaurants, and it's a good back and forth. And meanwhile, there's this whole contingent in Cleveland that they're fighting at the same time, and the same thing, Hip Sing versus An Leong, and they're just going back and forth. And but Frank is the gangster. He's the guy that really amps it up.
And they had like some national control here. It sounds like, right? I mean, there was almost like I don't quite know how to describe this, but really, in some ways, the Chinese organized crime, all roads kind of came and went through Chicago.
They did. Well, the Hip Sing they had New York and they had San Francisco. The An Leong had Chicago. The Hip Sings were in Chicago, but they always kind of controlled Chicago. But from Chicago, they would run Pittsburgh, Cleveland, like I said, most of Florida, Atlanta. They had something out there, Houston. But New York, interestingly, the An Leong, they had their presidents would answer to Chicago's president. At one point, the president was from Pittsburgh, but he was really just a Chicago guy that had moved out there. So. It's a lot like the old outfit. It's all roads led back to Chicago.
I absolutely no idea.
Yeah. I don't think most people do. I mean, that's what's so amazing about this. And I read through it, I'm just like, this is just so crazy.
This plays out like one of the coolest movies ever made.
Except I don't even know how you capture the scope of it. You know what I mean? It's so, and it's amazing how.
This is like an 8-hour Brian De Palma film.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. What's his name? Sergio Leone.
Sergio Leone.
Yeah.
It's like you're in for like a weekend of it.
So the book kind of goes through, the tit for tat, the back and forth. That this murder led to this murder, and this guy. Yeah. So in one of them, one of the assassins found out he was an An Leong assassin, and he found out that Hip Sing's put a contract out on him, but he found out who took it, and the guy was from Milwaukee. So our assassin, our An Leong's assassin, got on an Amtrak, went up to Milwaukee, found him, and killed him before he could get killed.
These guys are awesome.
And then proactive.
Another murder, Mike. I found through the medical examiner's office that details it, because they had the old coroner's inquest.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
And it had the 2 guys that were named. And that's how I found who was named for this murder, who did this murder. And it's in the book. And it's just one of the random, 30 or 40 murders that had happened. And I didn't think anything of it. After this was published, the great-granddaughter reached out to me.
Is that right?
And she read the name of the assassin, and she was like, that's who also we suspect killed my great-grandfather. And she had written a play. She's from San Francisco, and she had written a play, and it was on, in a small community theater in San Francisco. And it was just really neat to talk to her that his name resonated with her. She's like, I know that story. Yeah. They kind of start out as this benevolent association where they're going to protect workers, they're going to protect this guy, and they're going to protect their people, and it just kind of evolves and it morphs. Now, what does happen is after Frank, the gangster, dies, Gerald takes over. Gerald is the next Godfather of Chinatown. Gerald is a World War I vet, fiercely patriotic. Now World War II is about to start. He's in the Red Cross. He's in the. He's like one of the guys wearing the white helmets, lights out. You know what I mean?
Right,
He's one of those volunteers.
Like Thomas Shelby. So it sounds like you're talking about Tommy Shelby.
Yeah, right. But he personally legitimizes and gets away from that gangster, that gangsterism of the 20s. Yeah. And he's the one that kind of, the casinos are still going, the rackets are still going, but he puts on this public face. And he gets married in a Christian church. That was a big deal. That was news, and so he kind of goes the way of, and that's why it's so close to the Godfather and the Al Capone stories of,
Is this
how
stuff
we're going legit?
Is this stuff hitting like the Chicago press while it's happening, like in the 1920s, 1930s? Like, are these murders making the news, or is it because it's Chinatown? It's just totally flying under the radar.
They're blips. I found a couple articles that I quote in here, and a couple police quotes, and quite a few from Opium Dong himself. He'd love to talk, but no, I mean, there was so much more going on with O'Banion and Capone and Bugs Moran that this kind of flew under the radar. It's largely overlooked.
And in the Chinese community, gambling is just, especially then, was everybody gambled.
Yes.
Which is, I mean, look, I shouldn't limit that to
everybody gambles.
China,
Yeah.
Right. In the black community, the numbers were huge. Reading community,
Policy,
numbers were
volleyball.
huge.
Yeah.
And then, in the Italian and Irish neighborhoods, it was sports gambling and also numbers to a degree, but everybody had it. But
You definitely argue that it was cultural. These were old games that came over. Mahjong had a huge explosion in the 20s where, you could find it at fancy restaurants, but yeah, some of the Bung Lu and some of the other games of chance, most of them which could be rigged,
Right.
That's where things went wrong, I think, most of the time.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's what I meant. The Black Hand, which was most prevalent in New York City, kind of the precursor to the Italian mob there, never really got a foothold here because the Italian mobsters here didn't like the way they leaned on the businesses, so they pretty much killed them. And a Black Hand never really. I mean, it gets a little press here, but it didn't get the kind of.
Right.
They never got the.
They controlled that little hell, where Cabrini Green is now. That was a ramshackle neighborhood back then, and yeah, they just got pushed out by basically more business-minded than thug-minded, people.
Yeah.
You're just extorting your own people when we should be making money selling booze and rackets and gambling and things like that.
Yeah, so I just wonder how much of that was probably the similar in the Chinatown, basically.
Well, and it was cultural to be clever, more clever than the next guy, So if you were the hustler, and like in Goodfellas, where she says it was just that's our guys were working harder than everybody else, and that was it. It was he was hustling harder, he was making money, he was quick-witted and how he could run this gambling game, whatever, and that wasn't frowned upon, However, the violence was,
Yeah, that's amazing.
And
I know you got a million questions, so fire away.
no, keep going. The more you talk, the more this is the best thing ever.
So Gerald Moyd, like I said, takes him into legitimacy. Yeah, and it's pretty quiet in the 50s and 60s, and it's a good old days for everybody, right? And there's not much going on. And then the 70s hit, and things start getting shook up everywhere. I mean, you think about the evolution of the street gangs at the time, right? And so there's this whole wave of what they called Hongqing, the new ones. And so these little gangs start popping up. Now, the Anliang have always had their younger crew, and they were called the Ghost Shadows. And they were the minor league team, you know? They were like the Cinos to the Chicago's Grand Avenue outfit, right?
Like affiliates, yeah.
Yeah, they're just the young guys. And what starts happening is then
Boy,
now there's
I'm gonna get the calls about that.
Yeah.
You're gonna mention the Cinos. That's all right. Hey, take responsibility. Go ahead.
But now there's the Black Eagles. Now there's the White Eagles. Now there's I gotta look at my notes. Flying Dragons, Chinese Freemasons. Like all these little groups start popping up. Some of them affiliated with the Anliang, some of them affiliated with the Hip Sings, and some of them are just street gangs. For a little while, our gang intelligence unit which was like Gangs South maybe, or Gangs West, or maybe even before, maybe when it was still like the SOG guys, the gang guys. But the two major gangs in Chinatown were the ABCs, which was American-born Chinese, and FOBs, the fresh off the boats. So there was just this rivalry where they were fighting in the streets.
Did they call themselves that? Or?
Oh yeah, no, that was the tags. You know, they were spray painting and stuff, and yeah, and they were short-lived little street gangs, you know, rivalries. But the reason I bring that up though is because now Wilson Moy, who is now the Godfather of Chinatown, he's opened it up. So everything Gerald kind of did, Wilson just said, yeah, all right.
I mean, this has been the same family then for generations.
Yes.
For decades.
Yes.
So, like, I know that in multiple conversations, like the 1970s in Chicago have been described as like the wild, wild west. Chinatown just goes off the hook, just off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah, Chinatown. And, no, and it's not as violent as a lot of the street gangs, you know, I'll stop naming street gangs.
Oh, you can name them. I don't care.
But no, I mean like the violence associated with you know, like the the different the neighborhoods changing, the demographics changing, and the violence that was associated. Chinatown didn't have that. What they did have though were a lot of younger members that weren't quite the status of Anliang, who were kind of starting their own thing. And so you had this, where it was kind of a tentative agreement, and this Hip Sing Anliang peace treaty had been going on for the better part of 30 years, you know? And it all changes in 1977 when a couple guys who were disgruntled members of Anliang's and Ghost Shadows decide to knock off the Hip Sing casino. And it's a robbery on the north side that goes bad. They end up almost beating to death one of the guys who was trying to hide his watch.
Did you know where the casino was? I'm so curious.
Yeah, it was Argyle. It's in the book. I want to say 1170, right off of Argyle Broadway. The Hip Sing still has their headquarters there. It's right under the L tracks on Argyle. There's a picture in the book. You'll recognize the front.
Don't go there. He's going to be there tomorrow.
They're not organized crime.
Right.
They're a neighborhood association. They've dropped off from everything. All the crime in the 20s and things like that. But so after 1977, that's when Wilson Moy says, "Oh no, we're not going to stand for this," and it leads up to these Ghost Shadows who are kind of taking over these smaller gangs in Chicago. In the meantime, the Vietnamese have showed up, the Cambodians have showed up, Filipinos have created their own thing. So now they're all branching out, and who can we use for what purpose? And they all start branching out, and there's this group of, basically, like I said, Fat Man is one of those disgruntled Ghost Shadow members who decides, I'm not following the rules anymore, we're going to do our own thing. Now, around that same time is a guy named Nicky Louie, who's famous in New York. And he was New York Chinatown, he was a Ghost Shadow member, leader. They used to say that when he walked down the street, you could hear jingling because he had so many bullets in him still. He survived. But he comes to Chicago and he messes everything up. So he takes he kind of groups all the disgruntled members of each of these little gangs, and they start knocking these guys off. And the Hip Sink robbery is one of them. One of our Ghost Shadows from here goes on this, it grabs a crew, and they hit a place in Indiana. They rob it, and they're all violent takeover robberies. They rob a joint in Indiana. They rob a joint in Cincinnati. They're tying the people up. They do New Jersey. There's an off-duty copper in there who shoots and kills one of them. So then they run back to Chicago. They get arrested here. So this is This is when Wilson Moy says this, I've had enough, you know. And then while this is building up, and there's a story in there where they knock off a gun dealer up on the north side too. And the guns end up in Toronto and in New York and in Pittsburgh. So just like we're saying, they have this network.
Yeah, so let me interrupt you real quick, because often I get some of our listeners say I gloss over the technical stuff too much. We have these conversations where you and I have had these conversations 100 times, and we know exactly, and Chris knows this well enough and has been behind a bar long enough, he understands it too. But for our listeners, I mean, when you're talking about knocking off, that basically is a robbery. And it's not a murder necessarily.
And it was a violent home invasion, takeover, tie up the old lady and the old man.
That's right. Yeah. And that's what when we talk about a takeover robbery, that's what we're talking about. Those traditionally to us, and unfortunately we're seeing some of those more common these days.
Yeah.
And you guys are feeling it in the bar industry, unfortunately. Takeover robberies used to be unusual for us, and when they happened, it was a crew, and they were a bad, scary crew, and we really wanted to get them off.
They differentiated from the stick-up man, right? That guy would meet you on the corner, give me all you got, and he's around the corner and gone.
He wants
right?
to get away. He doesn't
These
want to
guys
engage.
Are taking over.
Yeah,
they're
getting organized. They're going into a place expecting violence or looking to cause scary violence. Coming into your house, they're coming into your place of business.
That's a bad crew.
Yeah.
Bad crew. There are so many variables once that begins that can lead down a horrible path.
Right. As an example, they hit the one place and there's an off-duty cop in there.
Right.
And he shoots and kills. And that's why those crews are always, for us, we're always like demanding immediate attention because of that level of violence, you know. And you'd hear even the Chicago outfit guys talking about some of that guy came from a takeover crew, or a tavern crew.
Yeah.
And that meant he was a little crazy. And you could be used to your benefit if you're an outfit guy, but you had to watch him, you know, and eventually you're probably going to have to put him down because he's too crazy, right? So I just wanted to get that out there. That's what we're talking about. These are dangerous crews, and when they're going on doing these takeover robberies, that's a step up in violence. You know?
The guy who gets killed in New Jersey, it's him and his brother that are out there. So his brother actually, he took a pinch here, and we were just talking about extorting the business guys. He was extorting a mechanic for $100 a week, and the mechanic had enough. And actually, the mechanic was dutifully paying his dues every week. And he was short one week, and they beat the hell out of him. And that's when they went to the police.
How much control did they have over the drug trade during this period, 1960s, 1970s?
Well, so it's not clear. I mean, as much as opium was still going on, later in the book it does talk about when Wilson Moy, after the murder, they get an informant inside Wilson Moy's casino.
After Fat Man's murder?
After Fat Man's murder, sorry. They get an informant inside, and it's amazing. Like the description of the casino is amazing that he gives, and then that I was able to find out, and like through old architect plans and stuff like this. It was a really cool place. There were secret tunnels, and there was big steel doors, and the slider thing. Who is there? You had to have a password, whatever. But he ends up cooperating with the federal government and taking down Wilson Moy and the An Leong. In the meantime, he also starts cooperating in the opium trade. And Operation White Mare happens in New York City, and it's run out of the feds out of New York because it never touches Chicago. And although it's being ordered from Chicago, the dope goes from the Golden Triangle in Thailand and comes into New York, and that was their first. I mean, I'm sure there were smaller seizures here and there.
We're talking mid-'80s.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. And so Operation White Mare at the time was the largest, and it was being shipped in tires, and it was the largest heroin pinch at that time to the date. Right. And it was their first kind of, they're bringing a shit ton of, I'm sorry, I can't say it.
No, you can say it. Yeah, sure.
They're bringing a shit ton of heroin from Asia,
Yeah, right.
And while there were always, smaller seizures here and there, that's when it kind of blew up that the An Leong was sponsoring this, or at least tacitly receiving money through their channels and saying, okay, you're going to come through our town, or you're going to bring this through our city, you're going to owe us money.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the way that worked too was opium kind of morphed into heroin.
Right.
Sometime in the late 50s, probably, right? And in heroin, it's a little tough to track, right? Because the Chinese did control a lot of that input from the Golden Triangle, and that I think most of it, heroin at that time, came from that area.
Yes.
But they would sell it to like Bumpy Johnson, Frank Lewis, and those
Right.
in New York and in Chicago. We had those guys, and it's what makes it a little bit hard to kind of track.
But they had never attached it to the An Leong in a larger corporate like criminal enterprise
Right.
before White Mare.
Yeah. Oh, gotcha.
Yeah.
And then that really starts to kind of cull the Chinese triads, Tongs, organized crime, right? I mean, as you kind of point out, it really starts with Fat Man's murder at the end. In fact, you told me in our conversations leading up to this, it's kind of the family secrets and the family secrets in Chicago was a trial in the mid 2000s, which it was responsible really for kind of the end of the large scale Italian Chicago, the outfit here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the Fat Man murder was, you kind of equate to that.
I do, yeah. So Fat Man, like I described, he's in this, just loud fashion, like this statement of a murder, from the An Leong building, from the most famous building in Chinatown. Snipers hired New York City to send upon Fat Man Chin for messing with their guy, their Red Pole, Henry Fong. He doesn't die. He takes a couple of months for them to die, but when he does, he gives a dying declaration of who killed him, and he's one of the ghost shadows from New York. The police actually heard the shots and showed up, ran up the stairs, and they found one of the assassins still up there, but he wasn't near the shell casings. He was in an adjacent room, but then they were later, through witnesses, they later got charges on Lenny Chow, Sik Chun, and Paul Tang. So all three of them, and it was great detective work. These guys worked their asses off, and it was great detective work. And so all three of them got charged with murder, and they were found not guilty, which, like I kind of explained, was a huge victory for the Godfather of Chinatown at the time, Wilson Moy. However, that kind of brings, all right, now there's a federal eye on it going, we can't let this happen. What's going on?
Is this a Grey Lord era kind of thing?
Their biggest break is when Bob Cooley walks in that federal office and says, I was paid off to do this case, this case, this case. I was paying off judges to win these cases. One of them being Fat Man's murder.
Wait, so this is Fat Man's murder. The trial of the murder of Fat Man is wrapped into Operation Grey Lord.
Well, the judge is.
The judge is.
So later in Gambit, Operation Gambit, it comes out, but he's not, I think they use it in aggravation. Fat Man's murder doesn't come out till Wilson Moy's RICO indictment 12 years later.
So what we're talking about here for our guest, Grey Lord, famous operation here in Chicago where the feds took down a series of corrupt judges and attorneys who are fixing cases. A great documentation of that is the movie Thief, James Caan, one of the great kind of crime dramas ever made, in my opinion, Michael Mann film. They show it, and it was so obvious, like, they're giving hand signals to the judges for how much it'll cost to get out from underneath a case, which actually happened. And this is 80s.
This is 80s. Bob Cooley walks in and says...
Bob Cooley was an attorney, private attorney.
And it's Operation Gambit, so it's the precursor to Grey Lord.
And Bob Cooley was a private attorney who was a fixer, basically. He was a guy that could set up a lot of these. And he flipped. There's a book written about that. I can't... names...
When Corruption Was King.
When Corruption Was King. Thank you very much. Where Cooley kind of lays out all of that.
He does an amazing job. And he goes to meet Rhodey and Pat Marcy, and they say, we need you to take care of this case. Here's the judge's money. Here's your cut, And his story's pretty amazing because he gets flown to New York and given the VIP treatment, basically. And he's treated as a hero there, But, yeah, so he's the one that kind of breaks it open that not only is Wilson Moy, he's got Chinatown wide open as far as the rackets, but now the outfit's got a piece. When Rhodey cares about it, the outfit's got a piece. And later comes out in trial, Angelo the Hook LaPietra is the one that says, you want to gamble in Chicago, you pay us.
Right.
You know, and so we're kind of talking like in the 20s where they had kind of a tacit, you don't mess with my rackets, we can make money off each other, that's great, but but the war was between the Hip Sings and the An Leongs, not the Hip Sings and the Italians, or the Hip Sings and Bugs Moran's gang, you know, the Irish guys, nothing like that. Later we learned in the 70s and 80s, they couldn't do anything without the outfits say so.
Yeah. So basically, well, first of all, for my listeners, I mean, there's going to be a lot of people that hear these names and they're going to know exactly what we're talking about. If you don't, and you're interested in this, get a hold of us, email me. I can explain all of that part of it to you. And first of all, I highly recommend, if you're interested in this, buy Greg's book, because it's an amazing documentation of this. We kind of need to wrap up here a little bit, but so just to wrap that part of it up, that kind of ends the...
That really is the death knell. That RICO against Wilson Moy and An Leong, and the biggest thing they did, you know, the tax stuff killed them, but they took the An Leong building from them. When they lost the building and it became a community center, that destroyed that organization.
Gotcha.
You know, and there's no doubt gambling still exists. There's no doubt there's an An Leong, and maybe there's criminal organizations running things, some sort of rackets there. Nothing to the extent it was when it was wide open under Wilson Moy. Right. I do want to add one more thing that's really interesting between the outfit and when we think of the mafia stuff. And so before the RICO comes down, they have Senate committee hearings, and it's a lot like the Valachi hearings, where they bring these guys in. They're trying to find out, do we have a bigger problem here? Well, they have a ghost shadow actually testify. The way he describes the initiation into the An Leong organization mirrors what they would do for the mafia. It's almost down to the word for word. Some of the oaths they had to take, and the bloodletting, and you know the sect.
Like Omerta type.
Yeah, the Omerta, how sacred it was. They took these rituals, and you know, but it's really, really interesting that, you know,
same
two
kind of
different parts of the world and how close it was to
to
join their organization.
Yeah, to make it kind of a blood commitment almost to the organization, to put weight on it, right?
Yeah, that was one of the most interesting things I found.
Yeah, it really
how
is
similar the initiation was.
Yeah, you know, we could do this for hours, and but I don't. We're limited time a little bit here. Chris, anything you'd like to jump in? Not to put you in a corner, but
from this point on, I want to be called Fat Man.
Fat Man.
Not Opium Dong.
Opium Dong. I think
Opium
for
Dong.
sure.
I don't. After
Dong.
hearing about this guy, I don't think I could live up to his reputation.
I mean, first, Eric, thanks so much, man.
No, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Stuff.
These are like some of the most colorful characters, like the whole really lexicon of Italian mobsters, and it's been glamorized in the movies. It's part of the fabric of history of America, history of Chicago, but this is something like this is all new to me, and it's so huge, and it's
that's what struck me when we first started talking about this, and he told me about this book that he'd done, and I was just like, it's unbelievable.
And it's what drew me to it, is how overlooked it was, you know.
And I mean, I've walked by that building for the last 30 years on a regular basis.
Sure.
I walk by the building on Argyle at least once a week.
Right.
I mean, I live in that, not far from that neighborhood. I'm over there all the time.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, gonna stand outside and just be like,
There's nothing going on anymore.
Again, and we don't mean to disparage Chinese people and make this about them, but every ethnic group in this city has had some hand in organized crime and the history of it.
I spent 30 years in organized crime. Nobody has a copyright on it, you know?
No, it's really young. I mean, he come to me, and we really do need to wrap up, but he comes to me.
Yeah.
So
It's so
that's
incredible.
what I appreciate having you here. I mean,
My pleasure. It was fun.
We're great friends, and we do this over beers. It's great to have you here and talk about this. I hope you'll come back, because we could do this about the C Notes and the Grand Avenue guys, or the White
history.
Gangs on the North Side, or the big shoot at the
Cancy and the TJOs.
Yeah, right. Well, the TJOs, the Thorndale Jagoffs.
Yeah.
One of my favorite gang names ever. You know what I mean? So, but anyway.
I don't know if I could talk about that.
Fair enough.
Good stuff.
Fair enough. Chris,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks again, Mike.
Until next time.
Yeah, man. Thank you. Appreciate it, brother. Hey, again, thank you very much for joining in. We really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. The book, again, will be The Godfathers of Chicago's Chinatown. Will be linked in on the website and in the show notes. If you have questions, hit us up. Hey, so there you have it. Really cool interview with my buddy Greg Daly at Fava Podcast Studios with Chris. It was a lot of fun having that conversation with Greg. He's a really knowledgeable guy, as you can tell. And this book he's written about the Chicago Chinatown organized crime history is really, really cool. On top of that, I've got a couple interviews here for you. As Greg mentioned, after writing the book, he had contact with a couple of women whose families go back 100 years with these Chinese Tongs here in Chicago, both of which had family members who were killed or likely killed during this violence in the early part of the century. So the following are interviews with both. The first, Nancy Wang, as of this release of this recording, in 2 days, she's going to be doing a screening that you can watch and attend online of her play Shadows and Secrets, which this little thing you won't be able to see well here, but I will have it in the show notes. And that is her story of the mysterious death of her grandfather, who was a mover and shaker, as you'll hear, in the Chinese community. He got sideways with the Moy family and ended up paying with his life. Really fascinating story. She's up first, followed by Monica Eng, who is a local celebrity here in Chicago, writer with WBEZ, has podcast. She also had a great uncle who was murdered for certain during these Tong Wars in the very early part of the 20th century over a dispute with restaurant rights as part of this entire story. So I think you'll find both of these interviews really fascinating. I hope that you will enjoy them. I also hope that you'll support Nancy and her play. Should be a really cool event. So without further ado, here are those two interviews. I'll talk to you soon. Thank you very much. I'd like to take a moment from the program to have a real talk about safety and security. Toward that end, I would like to introduce you to my friends over at Blue Knight Security Solutions, your ultimate partner in protection. Blue Knight Security Solutions isn't just your average check your ID at the door security company. They're a team of elite detectives, investigators, and law enforcement professionals with unparalleled expertise. Whether you need their real-world investigative prowess or securing your home, business, synagogue, church, or event, Blue Knight has you covered. From risk assessment to tailored security plans, they'll ensure your safety. Blue Knight Security Solutions provides street-smart operators who can handle any situation. Contact Blue Knight Security Solutions today at 773-706-4920 or visit BlueKnightSecuritySolutions.com. BlueKnightSecuritySolutions.com. I'm very lucky and proud to have, I appreciate you being here, Nancy Wang, who is another interesting piece of this really cool story of the Godfathers of Chicago's Chinatown that we're doing. Nancy's a playwright and author, wears many cool hats. I'll let her tell you about that. Nancy, thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate that. And if you'd introduce yourself to my listeners, that'd be great.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for having me on, and it was great meeting you in person as well. So I am a fifth generation Chinese American, and I have been a psychotherapist with a private practice, as well as a dancer and playwright and a storyteller. So one day, I have no recollection why, I began to think about my grandfather. And that's what started me into the whole world of researching what was going on in 1920s to see what was happening that might have something to do with my grandfather's suspicious death. In our family, we always thought it was just an accident that he fell down 4 stories on his elevator, down his elevator shaft in his restaurant, the Mandarin Inn. But my grandmother had always accused her own brother of pushing him, but no one paid attention to her. And so that's all we knew. That's all we knew.
And just to interrupt real quick, the Mandarin Inn was here in Chicago?
Absolutely. It was in the first Chinatown, which was down in what's now called the Loop.
You're correct, yeah.
Yeah.
That kind
It
of
was on
south.
Wabash.
Yeah, right. That kind of what we would call now like the southwest corner of the Loop proper, over there off like Van Buren,
Right.
Clark Street, those places.
Right. We also knew that my grandfather was sending his entire family, which was, at this point, 5 more kids. One was already there. Another one had died. So maybe, I think there were 7 or 8 kids, and sending them all to China. And it never dawned on me to ask why he was doing that, because they were very successful and wealthy and had this gorgeous mansion. And he died the night before they were to leave. So that was another little alarm bell.
Sure. You've turned this story into a play. You wrote a play about it, and it's called Shadows and Secrets.
Yep.
I did a little flyer here. They're coming custom, and there we go. And this link will be on my episode, so anybody will see it, and you'll be able to view it on Friday, September 27th at 5 p.m. That's Pacific time.
Daylight time. So 7 o'clock your time.
7 o'clock our time in Chicago. Well, this is a really interesting story. I'm going to turn it into write a play or book or whatever your decision was at that time. But what did your kind of personal investigation reveal for you about your grandfather's death? Were you able to find out much at all?
Yes. My grandfather, for some reason, his name is Chin Fan Foin, F-O-I-N, was really good at using the media, the newspapers. So I was able to do a lot of research in newspapers.com and found a plethora of articles about him, what he was doing, what was next for him, what went wrong with, one restaurant. There was a fire, all kinds of things, weddings of, one of his daughters or stuff like that. And I found an article about a particular assassination that took place. And in the courtroom, he was fingered as one of the people that the assassin was supposed to kill. So something was going on, something that it just didn't seem like it was an accident anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Sounds like he was kind of a mover and shaker.
Right.
In the Chinatown area of that era.
Yes, and there were 2 clans that were at war with each other. That was the Moy clan and the Chin clan. We were the Chins. And the Moys had the Anliang Tong, and we had the Hip Sing Tong. Mm-hmm. I don't think my grandfather was a member of the Tong, but he was a bigwig in the Chin clan. So he had a lot of influence over what was going on. So if he did anything to annoy the Moys, or not annoy them, but said, I'm not going along with you, that was a problem.
Get sideways with them. Understood. Fascinating. So that must have been really interesting for you to determine. I mean, family history is, whether it turns out to be good or bad, it's almost always really fascinating, right?
Very, very fascinating. And it makes you think, well, my poor grandmother, what she had to go through. And I mean, they were wealthy and they become now poor. There was nothing. The restaurant wasn't able to continue, and all his money that he owed all the different, the boiler people and the utility, it was gone. So But, I had a dream, and I had a dream twice in the same night. And it was a dream that my grandfather came to me, and he had his back to me, and he was sitting at a desk. And on the desk was a tray. And on the tray were writing utensils, some kind of notebook to write on, and a ring of keys. And so I interpreted that as he really somehow, somewhere, wanted me to really look into what happened and set it free.
Good for you. That's fascinating. And I mean, from my kind of detective mind, it seems like, absent even other factors which may have been there, the fact that he was this really powerful business owner and kind of community leader, and then afterwards, all of that's gone. That in itself is a motivation for his murder, because that didn't just disappear. Somebody took all that over, right? I mean,
Yes. Someone tried. Grandmother apparently tried to keep the restaurant going, but
yeah,
and I know that. I mean, she was like a stay-at-home mom, right?
yeah.
Smart, but she had no business acumen, and it didn't work. So one of my suspects bought it, and also it didn't work. So, and I know during the one court trial with the assassination that happened, a Moy killed a Chin. And my grandfather is the one that hired a lawyer to go after the Moy Tong. That is crazy. I mean, we're talking, are you nuts?
Yeah,
So,
more a big potential motivation. Right?
yeah. And when that happened, his father and his brother and his cousin all closed down they also had a dry goods store, which was pretty big, and closed it down and left. So something was really.
Yeah, sounds like. So what year was your grandfather killed?
1924.
1924.
So it's 100 years now.
100 years exactly. I mean, just in hearing this story, and I certainly, I don't want to give anything away from your play. I haven't seen it or read it, but I mean, it just my detective mind is telling me it sounds like he was a man of some power, and clearly got into some type of, just my intuition tells me that he got into some power struggle, he got sideways with the Moys or somebody.
Yep.
And, he ended up being a casualty of that in some fashion, it sounds like, because especially with other family members, which were likely part of his, power base,
Clan.
leaving immediately after or soon afterwards. I mean, they didn't have their protector anymore.
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
because I found, that one trial was on, for sure, all over the newspapers, the Chicago Tribune. It was, and people from all over the country, and I mean from east to west, all the Chins came and sat in the courtroom. All the Moys came and sat it was like definitely a showdown between the Moys and the Chins.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the Moys, even though there was absolute, evidence that they did kill this one Chin person, he, of course, got off the Moys because they paid a lot of the judges, the lawyers, the cops. I mean, everybody.
Witnesses probably as well, right? Did you ever find any indication from the records as to if your grandfather was one of the intended targets in that original assassination, why he was?
Nothing was said. I couldn't find anything written about it. But I'll tell you, soon after that trial, my grandfather squealed. I mean, that's the only thing I can say. He had the police raid all the gambling rooms of the Moys and Chins. Yeah. I mean, I don't know what he was thinking. I mean, if his morals were so high that he was blind to what could happen, but then it makes sense that as things progressed over the years, that he was sending his family away. Don't you think?
Right. Well, I mean, once again, more motivation there, but also, I mean, he may have been simply out of options there. He may have gotten sideways with, the Moys, whoever controlled the power, so he couldn't go to them for relief.
Yeah,
So
the big
ultimately,
honcho boy. His name was
yeah.
Moy Dong Chu, and he started the new Chinatown, which is where it is now, and he brought all the Moy's businesses over from the first Chinatown, and he became like the mayor of Chinatown, and the Moys continue to be the ones in charge of Chinatown.
Hmm. Hmm.
So there was and I read somewhere that the Chins and the Moys were already at some kind of war even in China before they came here.
Yeah.
So it's
Hmm.
ancient.
Yeah, that seems to be especially in that early 20s and prior, the teens. I mean, this, according to the book that Greg wrote, this goes back to the 1870s here, and it all kind of
Mm-hmm.
spilled over from China. A lot of the
Yeah.
conflicts, anyway, right? So they followed the groups here, which of course just makes sense, I suppose. But um, so then, just tell us about your play a little bit. Did this kind of come to you as like, well, I want to maybe as a book like first, or how did you decide? Now this is always going to be a play.
It was always going to be a play. I did all this research and then I started putting it together. And then I did a reading in which I asked the audience to be investigative journalists. Who would they possibly want me to do more research on? Who do they think did it, etc. And then I went back and did more research and finally wrote it as a stage radio play of the 1920s, kind of
Nice,
like what you're doing, right?
right?
And I
And
listened to all
I
those
love the
old
old time
20s.
radio shows. I love them. They're so
They
great.
were great. So that's what it is. It's a stage radio play. And if they want to if they want to see it, it'll be available on September 27th, and it'll be a recording of the actual production. It's not a recording that's in a studio, so it's a live recording. So there's, not always the best, but it still captures it.
Sure.
I can,
It sounds like a fascinating story, and we're going to give your audience a chance to play detective
yeah.
during this
I mean, because
play.
the last scene, almost the last scene, is when they're all in the same room and the two Irish cops are going at them, trying to get them to humble up and end up saying something, or
Hmm.
that makes them. I think that they all said it was an accident, so that's why Greg couldn't find anything more about it because there was no police. I mean, there was a police. The death certificate was held up pending an investigation,
Hmm.
but I think they just decided it was an accident because no one was talking, right?
Right. So real quickly, just so my listeners are up to speed, the actual story is grandfather was closing up his business for the evening. Is that correct?
No, he wasn't. He was staying and sending his family away, and he would meet them later. He would go later. I
Oh,
think
I
once
see.
he probably managed how he could continue his business. I mean, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Hmm.
But obviously that didn't happen because he died before the
Yeah.
day they were leaving.
But
No,
somehow he's on the fourth or fifth floor of the
fourth
building,
floor,
right?
where the
Fourth
kitchen
floor,
is.
right? And he ends up by hook or crook falling down the elevator shaft.
Right.
In the 1920s, falling down an elevator shaft was not as uncommon as it might sound now, and also not an uncommon way to get rid of somebody you wanted
Oh
to
my
get
God.
rid of. So it was a common way to hide a murder, basically. It seemed
Wow.
to appear,
Yeah. To make
right?
it look like an accident.
Yeah. So, even inside of that, there was some. You were telling me the other day. Our listeners understand we had this great meeting, Monica, Greg, and Nancy and I the other day. Was Nancy's on the West Coast, but she happened to be in Chicago, and so we got the opportunity to sit down. It was a lot of fun, very interesting. But we discussed that there was even some discrepancy among the story with his own family, correct? In what actually happened.
Yeah, they
Uh,
just assumed it was an accident after the investigation, and except for my grandma, who she must have held on to it because she wouldn't talk to her brother for 30 years until my father. I have one picture of our whole family at my uncle's place, and they're sitting next to each other. And my grandmother is, not a smile on that face.
You can see the tension in the photograph. Yeah. Well, I don't want to keep you too long. I mean, it's been a great conversation, but what have I missed? Anything that we should be talking about that we've missed in this?
I don't think so, except that, I know the mafia and the Tongs had an agreement about territory, right? I think they had to survive,
Yeah.
I mean, I have a picture of my grandfather sitting in his first restaurant, Low, I think it's called. Yeah. Anyhow, and he's sitting at the table with Hinky Dink.
But one of the original politician pictures.
Yes.
Yeah,
he was definitely crooked.
Right. Yeah. Hence the nickname, right?
Yes.
Walking around with a nickname called Hinky Dink.
But I don't know why he made some of the choices he made, but his first restaurant was above Hinky Dink's office.
So it's hard to, coincidence is a strange thing. I mean, in the homicide detective world, we don't really, coincidence is something that always we're suspicious of, and I would say that
yes,
that's unlikely to be a coincidence that he's above Hinky Dinks. You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like your grandfather was a real mover and shaker, a guy that had some real.
He just did one too many things to cause whatever.
Yeah,
I mean that trial. The reason why that first assassin and that the assassin is not the first assassination, but the one that was in all the newspapers was because the Moys wanted to control all the gambling rooms. Right. Chin's, whoever did it, and my grandfather and my great grandfather said no.
Yeah.
And so they started to.
Once again, in the realm of coincidence, and who knows what the detectives and the police were looking at,
or what they didn't want to touch.
Right. But, it's awfully convenient that he had an accident falling down an elevator shaft at the same time that a lot of people are trying to get rid of him. I think this is aptly titled Who Murdered Chin Fan Foin? Shadows and Secrets. It's I'm excited to see it. I am.
Yeah, and let me know what you think afterwards.
I absolutely will. You got it. You got it.
I wish you had been a detective at that time. No,
I don't know how long I would have lasted back in those days. I'm a little bit of a hardhead. I don't know how well I'd have played that game very long, but it would have been an interesting time that you've got. Hinky Dinks, associated with your father and
grandfather,
Johnny Torrio, and even Monica's grandfather had an outlier connection to Big Jim Colissimo, who Torrio and Capone murdered to take over the mob. Like it's a crazy small intertwining of history.
But it's amazing how today, I mean, I have a nonprofit called Ethnotech, and I just do my work, right? But then I can't imagine all the things you had to make sure of, all the connections you had to make, all the people you had to make sure you were doing them enough favors that you could continue doing what you did. I mean, the mind to be able to do all of that and run a business.
Yeah.
It's astounding.
Thinking on your feet all the time and looking over your shoulder a lot, I'm guessing, you know what I mean? Like is just, pure survival at that time, for everybody, immigrants. And, of course, it's well documented now what a difficult time Chinese immigrants had in this country, but, any immigrant people. Yeah. And then as you go up the ladder and start to gain, power and influence, then you become a target. Yeah.
I think my grandfather was too honest or too ethical or something.
Yeah.
My father was like that. So there are people still, hopefully, like you, who have that moral compass and go that other
I think we've covered everything, and I'm definitely, once again, we're going to go through this again. I have this, and I'll maybe put it up there and let it. Shadows and Secrets is what you can go see, and I'll have the link in the show. But I highly encourage it. It's going to be a fascinating little journey.
And then we'll be there. I'll be there, and two of the actors have agreed, or we'll see if one of them is if he has another rehearsal or something. We'll be there to answer questions.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
All right, great. Well, best of luck with that.
Thank you.
I hope it really takes off and a lot of people get the opportunity to see it. And once again, thank you very much for being a part of this really fascinating story. I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Thank you, Mike.
All right. I will talk to you soon. Really lucky today to add on to the Godfathers of Chinatown episode with Greg Daly, Miss Monica Eng. Monica, thank you so much for joining us. You've got a really great direct connection. Well, great's probably too strong a word. You lost a family member to this whole story. So first, could you just tell us, I know all your great bona fides, you're a writer and all kinds of great things, but could you just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind?
Sure. I'm a Chicago native. My kids are fourth generation CPS grads. I don't think I know anybody else whose kids are fourth generation CPS grads. Yeah. I'm a veteran Chicago reporter. I worked at the Sun-Times starting in 85 for many years, and then at Daly Southtown for a short time, and I was at the Tribune for 16 years, WBEZ for 8 years, and now I'm an Axios Chicago reporter and have been for 3 years, and the author of Made in Chicago, a book about foods invented here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. That's an impressive resume. Good for you, both in terms of your work career and your family Chicago history. You guys go back a long way in this city. So what brings us here today really is I just wanted to discuss with you, and talking with Greg about his book, he found that I don't recall, forgive me, how this connection was made, but either he or you realized that your family was directly affected by this story, the story of organized crime in Chinatown. And so could you just tell us a little bit about that? First, do you recall how you made that connection with Greg?
Well, Greg's written this book, and I guess he's followed my work for a while. We're both Chicago authors, both intensely interested in the city's history. And I first understood that maybe this murder in my family had something to do with the Tongs when actually Todd Stroger Jr. sent in a question to Curious City, where I was the reporter for many years. And that show, basically, people ask questions about Chicago, and then I need to answer it.
Gotcha. And so as you, dug into your family history and that, you realized that you had a great uncle who was murdered by the Tongs in 1936, correct?
Yes. Yeah, for years, families, originally a lot of Chinese families were buried in the Rose Hill Cemetery. There came a point in the 20s and 30s where Rose Hill didn't want Chinese families there anymore, because traditionally Chinese would, frankly, dig up the bones and send them back to China, because you're supposed to be buried in your birthplace. And so they figured these aren't very good customers if they're going to keep reusing these plots. Right. Plus, many Chinese will bring food to the grave and as an offering to our ancestors. And people were complaining that attracted rats. I'm not sure if it did, but that was the excuse to kick the Chinese out of Rose Hill. And so we all went to Stickney, Illinois, to Mount Auburn Cemetery, where there's an enormous Chinese and Asian area of the cemetery. And we would go out there twice a year with all my aunts and uncles, and we would go bow 3 times at every grave. And whenever we got to Uncle John's grave, our parents and aunts and uncles would say, "Poor Uncle John, he was murdered in 1936, and the murderer wanted to get your grandpa, but thank goodness he didn't get your grandpa. Someone called your Grandpa Harry and said, 'Watch out, Harry, a killer is after you.' He escaped, and the killer was delayed when the Wabash Bridge went up, and then, yay, we lived happily ever after." By the time I became a reporter later, I actually dug up the clips on this, and I was like, "Holy cow! There are clips." You know, and when there were so many newspapers, there you get like 4 accounts of different murders in Chicago. We only have 2 major dailies. I'm hoping those will stay. And I just didn't understand. Okay, so the murderer may not have gotten him that day, but why didn't he go back the next day and get him? And when you're a kid, and especially in Asian families, nobody likes to really air dirty laundry. It's always like these heroic stories of your family. Nothing bad ever happens.
Right.
So I finally said to an uncle, my uncle George Tan, who owned the House of Wang with my Auntie Joni. It was our final restaurant and a big restaurant empire we had. Closed in the late 80s. George was in his 90s, is a couple years before he died. And I was interviewing my Auntie Joni about our family. And I said, I still don't get it. We go to Uncle John's grave, and you guys always say that, he was killed by some jealous rivals who wanted to kill Grandpa Harry. I don't understand why they didn't kill Grandpa Harry. And then he says, "Let me tell you, Monica." And I sent you the video. I'm hoping maybe you can pull some audio off of it. And he explains that there were these 2 major tongs, as you probably talked about, the An Leong and Hip Sing, that represented people in the Chinese community, and they had many roles, including relocation, education, loans, and things like that. But they were also involved in some illicit activity, including gambling, probably prostitution, probably drugs. And they were not above enforcing rules. And one of those rules was the 1 mile rule, as Uncle George tells it. And if someone outside of Chinatown, obviously you've got a ton of restaurants next to each other in Chinatown, but outside of Chinatown, if you have a successful chop suey restaurant, nobody is supposed to come in and horn in on that business. And according to the newspapers, there was a place called the New Paradise Inn, and while it was closed for renovations, our family opened up the Paradise restaurant just around the corner, and that did not sit well with the other restaurateurs when they reopened. They're like,
they kind of, first of all, we're talking about West Garfield Park.
Yes,
here, right?
yes.
I mean, not anywhere near Chinatown, kind of south, which is where Chinatown is now, or Chinatown North, which is kind of Argyle and Broadway. Right?
Yeah.
This is out in West Garfield Park. In those days, was probably
very
Jewish,
yep,
right?
Yeah. And so, the rules applied. It was around Pulaski and Madison where the restaurant was, not far from one of my my great-grandfather's other places, which was this huge dance hall that actually he lost in 1929. In the 1920s, he had this giant dance hall called the Golden Pumpkin. And so these guys said, "Look, you can't do this. You can't open up this restaurant." And according to Uncle George, we said, "Tough luck, Chuck. We're going to open it." And they went to their gang leader and the An Leong, said, "This guy violated the rule." So a killer, an assassin, came in, supposedly ordered some takeout, shot Uncle John, and then said, "Where's Harry?" And he didn't get Harry that day, but I'm told that the An Leong leaders came to our family and said, "You can pay up $50,000 and join the An Leong, or you can get killed." And so that's how that part of our family became An Leong members. And my Uncle Harry, who's still alive, said that he was inducted as well. He was like, "Where are we going, Dad? I don't understand. We're going down to Chinatown for what?"
Right.
And yet Uncle George said that he joined Hip Sing because it was a better fit for him. And he went to his father-in-law, my Grandpa Harry, and said, "Hey, look, no hard feelings, but this is what I'm joining. It's just business." So we had folks on both sides.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I mean, a couple observations that I'd like to hear. One is, it sounds like your great uncle John, and was Harry your great grandfather as well?
He was my grandfather. So Uncle John was one generation above him. So they said Harry Yang's uncle was shot.
I got you. So, I mean, it sounds like to me, based on my instinct, no offense, that Harry and John must have been kind of gangsters themselves to say, "Yeah, we're going to open up the Paradise
Inn, yeah,
right around the corner from the new Paradise Inn." Not only violating the 1 mile rule, but kind of like, "Yeah, we like your name too," right?
It seems like a very ballsy move, and frankly, a dangerous move that did not turn out well for Uncle John. I still, I have to say that my Uncle George and my Grandpa Harry, they had a bit of a rivalry. And so, Uncle George was like, yeah, your reckless grandfather, he decided to do this and he broke the rules. So sorry, he had to pay the price. And I can't imagine anyone else in my family speaking so coldly about
Yeah, right.
Grandpa
Right,
Harry.
right. And also he was able to come up with 50G in 1936 is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But also, I mean, traditionally in gangland across cultures, like you kill my uncle, I need some payback. But I guess in this instance, it was a matter of, all right, well, we pushed the boundary, and so we're going to make peace. It sounds like we knew what we were kind of getting ourselves into. It sounds like a little bit, right?
And it sounds, and probably there was protection for the rest of the restaurants for, several decades to come.
That makes a lot of sense. And you told me another interesting side note story too. So the dance hall, correct me if I'm wrong, but then you tell me the dance hall, you had a band, like a house band that was pretty popular in there, and eventually through agreement or hook and crook or whatever, they left, and then they went, is it true? You told me they went to Big Jim Colissimo's place?
Yeah, I don't know if it's Colosimo or Colissimo. Yeah, Thelma Terry and her Playboys was the name of the house band. And there's actually someone who's writing a history of Thelma Terry, and she called me and she asked, if I could tell her what I knew. I have a great aunt who was alive at that time, who was more than 100 and living in Hawaii. And I said, talk to Aunt Flo. She might be able to tell you. So Thelma Terry and her Playboys was the house band there. And it was one of the few women who led a band during the 20s. She played the stand-up bass. And there in books and in magazines, it said, Joe Wang was my great-grandfather. Joe Wang was saying, stop goofing around, get on the stage and start playing. And then Thelma Terry was sassing back at him. Yeah, and so you can still find her recordings on YouTube today. But after our place closed in 1929, when my great-grandfather lost basically all of his restaurants in the stock market crash, she went to Colosimo's place. And you can see that she was actually on the bill there.
Often. Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, almost everybody who listens to this is going to know who Jim Colosimo was, but for anybody that doesn't, he was kind of the original organizer of the Italian Chicago mob, and eventually he kind of brought Johnny Torrio and Al Capone here to be his muscle or whatever, and they pretty quickly decided, well, we can do what he's doing, and they bumped off. Let's see, one of the most famous original Chicagoland murders. So it's a crazy connection of stories here, this whole thing. But
and as you know, Chinatown and the Italian outfit, there was a lot of overlap. Chinatown was landed in an Italian area and also very near Bridgeport. And so I think I mentioned to you that I was surprised when I saw some of my older cousins, my second cousins, their wedding photos, and Fred Rohde, the famous alderman who was a made man, was at the head table of my Chinese relatives' wedding. And I'm like, I don't understand why is Fred Rohde at the head table of the wedding? But my grandmother's brother, Wayne, he was one of the mayors of Chinatown for a long time in the 70s. And so that made sense. Okay, that's why Fred Rohde, who was the alder over Chinatown at the time, was close to my great uncle.
Right, and he was like the fixture extraordinaire, right? Rohde, anything that needed done, he got done for years and years. So it makes you could just see the overlap there, not just in aldermanic business, but also in the organized crime part. Anything that needed done, I think it. In fact, Greg references in the book that last murder being kind of fixed by Rohde and the offenders found not guilty, right? And that's kind of one of the most amazing things about all of this to me is how little known this history is of the Chinese organized crime, largely because the societies were so tight-knit and really didn't speak outside of the organization. There's also kind of this entire racism against Chinese people through most of the late 19th century, early 20th century, rights. It's just that Capone's group was so violent that they got
kind of
most of the
outshone
headlines.
us.
Right.
Yeah.
Amazing story. I really appreciate it that you telling this to us and coming on. Am I missing anything? There were a couple of things we were going to discuss, and
Yeah, I mean, there's this interesting point where when I did the story for Curious City, I heard from a young man who called me, and he said that his mother either heard the story or read it, and said, "We're the family. We're the one of the gentlemen who was charged for the murder was named King Eng." And they said, we're his descendants. And we were always a little salty that one of our relatives went to jail because of this. I said, I would love to meet with you and have some sort of peace talk. And he said his mother was not willing to do that. And I'm going to continue to work it. But the idea that there are two sides to this story, and there are descendants on both sides of these Tong Wars.
Yeah, right. And you're talking about the offender and great Uncle John's murder, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, it would be interesting because, again, I'm not all trying to disparage your family, but it would be interesting to hear. We might end up hearing that great Uncle John was a pretty tough guy himself, scary guy himself, right?
And they were just like, look, he went to jail for avenging something that you guys weren't supposed to be doing. And, by all accounts, we were not supposed to be doing what we were doing. Should I have killed him? I don't think so, but still.
Right. Seems a little extreme for what amounts to business disagreement. But, it's 1936. I guess, rules are a little different. And now, especially inside of cultures, where I think at that point, it didn't matter what the culture was inside of these cultural kind of clannish things, Italians, Irish, Chinese, pick one.
Yeah, and
these are rules, and if you have to follow these rules because, one, it keeps the police, American police, from getting involved in our business and putting our business out there, and two, it keeps control of our neighborhoods, right?
And I think in the video I sent you, it describes these parallel justice systems. Like they didn't trust the CPD or the Cook County courts. So we're going to have a justice system within the Chinese community. And so my Uncle George said at some point we were just like, enough. We can't have all this tit for tat Tong killings. And if anybody steps out of line again, we're going to give you over to the American justice system. We're not going to try to settle this internally anymore. And, he talks about going to DC and having this sort of peace conference where all the members of the hip sing, and their hip sings, St. Louis, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Chicago, all over. Everybody went to DC for this final peace summit and said, that is it. We are not going to, have all this murder. We come to this country to make money. Why are we killing each other? And you're going to be handed over to the authorities from now on.
Yeah. What time period was that? Would you
I asked him, and I thought it was around the 80s after that, gunning down from the Yong building at Wentworth and Cermak onto the streets. He seemed, his memory wasn't the greatest for some things. Yeah. He seemed to think it was more like 60s that was happening. So I wish I could pinpoint when that summit happened. I think it may have been the 60s, and then people stepped out of line again. Like a lot of the killings had calmed down, and yet there were some notable violations of the peace treaty.
Yeah, that's the way it sounds too. And the way Greg described it was that the kind of older generations had made this kind of peace agreement. And then like 70s, 80s, this younger group of up and coming Chinese like street gangs decided they wanted more of a peace. And so it kind of kicked up again, which led to ultimately the end of most of it by the mid 80s. And that Fat Man murder kind of kicked that off. And then later in the 80s, they started getting hit with the RICO statutes by the feds. And that pretty much took it down, as he describes it, like the family secrets trial for the Italian mob here, 20 years later or whatever. But it's an amazing story. It is pretty crazy that the family of the descendants of the killer reached out to you. Like, how often? I don't think I ever heard of that happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And that they had their own version of the story that we'd never thought of. We were the victims in our version of the story, and they kind of felt like we were the jerks in their version of the story.
Right. Yeah, well, now that I have seen that before, but yeah, that's just over that period of time. It's really crazy. Well, great. Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, that's really that's some fascinating stuff. It really is. And you and anybody who's listening that wants to take a deeper dive into this, Monica's done a lot of writing about it. I've got a great article in front of me here that you did. And what was this? Was part for WBEZ? It looks like you did that.
The Curious City story about the murder of my family. I shouldn't say Todd Stroger Jr. It was John Stroger's son, Todd Stroger, who asked a question: "Whatever happened to Chicago's Chinese gangs?" And I didn't think that I would end up writing about my own family when I started answering that question.
That's amazing. But in some ways, that's got to be kind of a cool, rewarding thing to learn about your family. I mean, most everybody that's got family going back very far in this country, or I guess anywhere, has got some things that are like, ooh, yikes, but still pretty interesting to know.
The elders
right?
never want to tell you when you're a kid. They always give you these whitewashed stories. And I would say anybody out there who's got an elderly relative, a lot of times, people don't talk to old people, but you really should, because a lot of times they will spill the beans in their 90s. If you just ask them the right questions, show them a few pictures, and then you get this kind of gold. I mean, obviously, it's very sad that we had a murder in our family, but it's gratifying to kind of understand the context in which it happened.
I was very close with my grandmother, who's 93 years old, and she was born in, I think, 1917.
Wow.
93 when she died. But, I mean, you're talking about really riding in horse-drawn carriages to seeing people go to the moon in one lifetime, right? I mean, it's hard to get your head wrapped around. It's hard to believe that they did, so those stories are just gold. I mean, I'm with you. I like you're lucky enough to have a family member, older than 80 years old. It's worth the conversation because
your phone now can record everything they say. You can do a video if you want, and believe me, you won't be sorry. But I think also these, these 100-year looks kind of show us that what goes around comes around. We were talking about the opioid epidemic, the gang killing epidemic in Chicago. Everyone always assumes that this is new in Chicago, and yet read the headlines 100 years ago.
No, absolutely right. I mean, that all the St. Valentine's Day massacre, all of that, which is widely considered like the low point, or I think is the best way to put it, of organized, criminality in the city of Chicago. That was over alcohol, which was illegal basically at the time. And then these Tong wars that were going on at the same time, which were as violent, were really over kind of opium trade, right? And this control and sale of that, other things that
restaurant trade, territory,
gambling, and you're exactly right. It kind of, unfortunately, we haven't figured that out. We're still working on that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the majority of our murders to this day in Chicago, and we have this unfortunate reputation as being this really violent city, but it is still largely over the control of, narcotic sales and the money that brings. I mean, that makes up a great percentage of it. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, this is very kind of...
It's troubling. Let's hope, in the next century we can find some way out of it.
Right. Figure that out. Yeah. Let's hope so.
Detectives out of business.
Yeah, right. It's like, come on. If we can't figure out something else to do, I mean, I guess there will always be angles.
Yeah.
Another topic for another day. But so, again, Monica, thank you so much. People who want to know more about what you do and your great writings and that, what's the best way for them to reach
so
out?
I write the Axios newsletter every day, axios.com/Chicago. You can see my reporting on City Hall and terrific tacos and best places for a cheeseburger.
Nice.
All over the place.
Yeah,
and I do a
that.
podcast called Chewing with Louisa Chu, who is the chief restaurant critic of the Chicago Tribune. And we just talk about food and have a good time.
I like that.
Chewing.xyz.
Nice. All of that will be in the show notes of this show, so I'll hook all that in. So people want to find it, they'll know how. So
well, great to see you, Mike.
You too. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. All right, we'll talk soon. Let me kill this.
Take care.
Okay, there you go. So that's a wrap on the Godfathers of Chicago's Chinatown. I appreciate Greg Daly's participation in this. You'll hear from him again, I'm sure, down the road. Greg and I will have a lot of fun talking, and as you can tell, he's an incredibly intelligent guy who knows a lot about the history of crime and organized crime in this city. Also want to thank Monica Eng, Nancy Wang for their participation. Really fascinating stories, and we appreciate them sharing it. Please support them. Nancy's live play should be really cool thing to see, and you could check out Monica at her podcast and her writings with Axiom. So that's all I got. I appreciate it. Thanks again to Chris Carlos at Flavor Podcast Studios. Do a great job over there. We really appreciate it. And to you guys, we appreciate your support. Keeps us rolling. So hit that like button, subscribe. If you're listening on the audio end, please download for us. Give us a review. We really do appreciate it. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Thank you.